So with the Industrial Revolution comes a lot of change, and one important area of change, of course, is the economy. We want to look at some of the different economic systems that develop during the Industrial Revolution and some of the reforms that take place. So the first one we'll tackle is capitalism. It's probably the economic system you're most familiar with because it's the one that we generally live in today. Now, before we talk about capitalism specifically, one term to get out of the way is factors of production. This is a term that's going to come up a couple times in this presentation. So think about what you need to make stuff, right? No matter what you're making, whether it's t-shirts or cars or machines, whatever you're making, there's a few things you need. And these are the things that economists call the factors of production. You basically need things out of the environment, natural resources. You need people, workers, and you also need things that we make to make life easier, right? And economists call these things land, labor, and capital. Land would be anything that comes out of the environment. Think water, metal ore, coal, fossil fuels, wood, all those things are land, that land part of the economy, or the land factor of production, or means of production as it's sometimes called. Labor, those are the workers, right? All the skill and simple hard labor that goes into making things. And then capital is the things we make to help us make things more quickly. That includes a lot of things. It's going to include machines in factories. It's going to include trucks to help move things. It's also going to include things like money. You know, money isn't something naturally occurring. It's something we created to help facilitate production. So as we talk about factors of production, keep in mind those are the things we're talking about. So capitalism is the economic system you're probably most familiar with. And it's the one that kind of comes to mind when you think about the economy, right? Why do people work? We work so we can make money. Why do we make money? So we can get stuff. That's the basic idea behind capitalism. And one of the key ideas behind capitalism is the idea of individually owned means of production. The idea that things like factories and land should be owned by individuals, and those individuals get to decide what happens to those factors of production. And they're going to hire labor, people to work for them. And in capitalist economies, when the business makes money, the owner of the business, the entrepreneur or capitalist or bourgeois or whatever you want to call him, he's the one that gets to decide how that money gets distributed. And naturally, he's going to choose to keep most of the money that he makes from the business and pay his workers as little as he can. That's so he can use this money to invest in more factories or better his business, which in theory is good for everybody. The first person to really explore this whole idea of capitalism in the modern era was a Scotsman named Adam Smith. Smith was actually one of these philosophers that we talked about during the Enlightenment. Now, we didn't bring him up when we talked about the Enlightenment because we focused on the political side. But just as people were looking for natural rights and natural law to govern society, Smith was looking for natural rights and natural law in the economy, trying to figure out how does the economy work? Is there a formula we can figure out or natural laws that govern it? And he came up with a whole bunch of them, actually, and he wrote a book about it that's called On the Wealth of Nations. He makes a lot of arguments, but his basic argument can be summed up in this phrase, laissez faire. Laissez faire is the term given by economists to this approach to the economy that says you should just leave it alone. Laissez faire is French for let it be. Smith was looking at the mercantilist policies that Britain had at the time, where the government's deciding whether or not to import things, tariffs to put on foreign goods, all to sort of try and regulate the economy in favor of Britain. And Smith thought that you didn't really need to do that. He said there's actually a set of natural laws that governs the economy, these natural laws of economics. And there's three of them. The first law is the law of self-interest. Think about the reason or the ways you make decisions, especially economic decisions. Smith would say the reason, how you make decisions is basically in your own self-interest. You go to the store and there's two goods that are of basically equal value. and equal quality, you're going to pay for the one that's cheaper. Why? So you can save money. So Smith said because people work in self-interest, the economy kind of works itself out and solves some of the problems itself. Another law is the law of competition. Let's say you got two businesses, business A, business B. They both make a similar product, but business A makes it a little cheaper and can sell it for cheaper than business B. Well, that means business A is going to be more successful. So business B has to compete to stay in the market. How do they do that? Either improve their product or lower their price. And who benefits in all this? You do, the consumer, because you end up with cheaper products at a lower cost. And so those ideas of self-interest and competition kind of generate a constantly improving society for consumers. The third law of economics is the law of supply and demand. Remember that in mercantilism, the government set prices for goods artificially through tariffs or through laws that determine how much goods should cost. Smith said you don't need to do that. Prices will set themselves through those two laws, supply and demand. Basically, the idea is that the more of something there is, the lower its cost. And the higher the demand of something, the higher its cost. So take something like gold. Why is gold so valuable? Sure, there's some of the scientific modern things, but basically gold's always been valuable because one, there's not a lot of it, and two, people want it. Low supply, high demand. Compare that to gravel. Gravel is in very high supply, and in terms of per volume compared to gold, much lower demand. So gravel's a lot cheaper than gold. And he says if you just let all the artificial constraints on the economy go, supply and demand will determine price, so nobody needs to set it themselves. And he's really thinking like an Enlightenment thinker. He's trying to apply a scientific approach to the economy. Now, one thing to keep in mind about Smith is that he's back during the 18th century. This is before the Industrial Revolution really took off. The kinds of factories he's seeing are these small water mill-driven factories where everyone's getting basically the same treatment. Compare that to later in the 19th century, we start seeing all these problems with the economy. Overcrowding, low wages, long hours. Other economists are going to have to deal with that, and their answers aren't necessarily maybe what you expect. So one of those guys was Thomas Malthus. Malthus is living in the late 18th century as some of the cities start to really grew in Britain. Think of Manchester, London, where their population just skyrocketed. Malthus was really interested in this. He's really kind of concerned. And he sort of wrote this essay, The Principle of Population. And his summary of it is basically that population, if you leave it alone, increases in a geometrical ratio. Subsistence increases in an arithmetical ratio. What's he mean by that? In 18th century talk, geometrical would mean like exponential, and arithmetical means just on a slope. So if you were to plot that, and by subsistence he means food. So if we plot this out, what he's saying is that population grows faster than the food supply. What happens when you get here, when population outstrips the food supply? Well, basically people starve. There's starvation, there's famine, there's disease. The population, of course, can't keep growing, so it falls down, and probably so does the supply of subsistence or food at that point. Eventually it rises up again, but never really passes that point of crisis very much. You're always going to have starvation. What do you do about that? Malthus says nothing. That basically you can't change human nature, that people will always outstrip the food supply and you can't stop them. You're always going to have a permanent poor underclass who are constantly on the edge of famine. And if you want society to function, that's kind of how it has to be. We call that disaster a Malthusian disaster. One thing to note is historically, we've never actually had one. Malthus' theory really hasn't proven out in history. But a lot of people based their idea on overpopulation and how we should govern population from Malthus. Another thinker, a guy named David Ricardo, looked at wages and and the cost of labor. One thing you really saw in the 19th century was wages were constantly driven low. So he decided to sort of try and figure this out. And he wrote a book about it called On the Principles of Economy and Taxation. And he came with sort of theory that we call the iron law of wages. Basically, wages do eventually rise. As wages rise, families get larger because they can afford to feed more people. Over a generation, now all of a sudden you have a huge surplus of labor. Thanks to supply and demand. If there's more work, or there's more workers than there is work, then the markets get flooded. If the markets are flooded, people are going to be unemployed. If they're unemployed, people are going to starve. If people starve, families get smaller. And then when families get smaller, the job market shrinks, and then wages go up again, and it's this cycle. Basically, his argument was wages are always going to be driven low, and it means you're always going to have a permanent underclass of people. What do you do about this? Ricardo says, nothing. Manufacturers need profit. Farmers need profit. And the laborer needs wages, but if you want to have a profit, you also have to have low wages. So you're always going to have a permanent upper class and a permanent underclass. For a lot of people, these aren't really good answers. And so you will see people in the 19th century try and figure out alternative solutions to the economy besides capitalism. We'll look at that in the next video.